Hello and welcome to From Warriors to Guardians, a conversation about transforming policing. I'm Kevin Morrison and I'll be your host. First of all, thank you for being here. We need you because this will be a conversation. If you have questions or comments, put them in the chat. We'll periodically stop and hear from you, either via chat or just by talking like people do. For myself, let me tell you what I'm looking forward to. I'm sitting in downtown Novato in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. This conversation about transforming police is particularly important to our county because we are nearing a transition. The sheriff, who has been in office for about 25 years, is retiring. Perhaps this will be an opportunity for reform, which is apparently much needed. Right now, data from the sheriff's office shows that law enforcement stops, detains, or arrests Black people in Marin at a rate 9 times more than what you'd expect based on demographics. Then there's the rapid growth of the unhoused population. Law enforcement remains ill-equipped to deal with the many variables that lead to living on the street or in parks and under freeways. And then there's the hands-off approach by Marin's political leadership. They say they can't oversee the sheriff, which is nonsense. But for years, there has been no political will to call the sheriff to account. So as we hear about transforming policing, I'm going to be paying attention to what that means in terms of racial and economic justice, as well as the role that civilian oversight might play. Now let me introduce our discussants. Michael O'Brien is based in Philadelphia, where he serves as an advocate for human rights and social change across multiple sectors and communities. Dr. Patricia Jones-Blessman is a licensed clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience as a clinician, consultant, and administrator of mental health programs. Edward Quevedo is the Director for Regenerative Design and Global Head of Practice for the Foresight Lab. The lab works with communities, companies, and governments to achieve cultural transformation. And with that, Ed, you want to get us started? I've got you muted, sorry. There you go.
I'll offer a couple of thoughts and just invite folks to jump in, as Kevin did, with questions. Our work in this domain has translated the diplomacy skills required to do battlefield peacemaking into our communities. And we began this work after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. Since then, we've worked in 17 cities, torn apart by predatory police killings. And although the work can be heartbreaking, because we take a systems approach to transformation of culture, we looked at cause and effect. And the first time that I looked at a police academy curriculum, it was in the city of Atlanta. And this was before Mr. Brooks' murder, but we were doing this at the behest of the previous mayor, before Mayor Bottoms. And I was rather horrified to see training that was like a boot camp. They were training warriors. And growing up as a person of color in an impoverished area of Los Angeles, I understand what it means to feel the police force as an occupying army. We quickly saw the need to transform the fundamental gestures of policing from warrior to guardian. This is the highest calling in a democracy, to be the guardians of the democracy and to protect and serve as peace officers. So we can talk about, and we'll talk about tonight, a few different models of this, but I'll end my opening remarks, Kevin, and thank you for pulling us together, and thank you, Patricia and Michael, for joining us. I'll end by saying that we have an opportunity at this inflection point in our societies to choose a different path. This is not about defunding the police, as we'll talk about. This is about changing our budgetary priorities and focusing on that highest calling, to treat community members with dignity and honor. Police officers want this, and the 99% of police officers who do the courageous, difficult work of protecting our communities with zero margin for error, they benefit from this curricular shift from a few hours of training to months and months of education. So that's how we view this transformation from warriors to guardians. And I'll step out of the way and let our other discussants step in.
Thank you, Kevin, for sharing your platform to talk about this very important issue. Thank you to this audience. I'm honored and humbled to have your time and your focused attention as we talk about police perpetrated violence. I bring to this discussion a number of identities. I'm a woman, and specifically a Black woman. I'm a mother of a Black son. I am a clinician who has worked in under-resourced communities with at-promise children. I pray and play as an adult in a community that is inappropriately policed. I also have several clients and many friends who are people of color and who are also police officers. So my perspective is woven by all of these lived experiences and realities. This summer, I was invited to conduct a healing circle with activists who had been working with the community after the Devontae Wright killing by Minnesota police officers. The opportunity came about simply because a major bank in the area had some extra money and wanted to throw some funding at a problem. And their incentive was to basically clean up their reputation to the community. They asked my colleague if she could pull something together, and she asked me to join her. Now, I wish I could tell you that this was a more thought out, planned for, targeted intervention, implemented with forethought and concern, intentionality, and measured planning based on clearly defined needs. But it was not that. It was just simply, let's throw some scraps at this and make something out of it. So we took those scraps. It's not the way that I would like to provide psychological service, because in essence, I knew that we were simply opening up a huge can of proverbial psychological worms with probably what would be a one-shot opportunity to do something meaningful. We don't have psychological first aid programs for gun violence, despite the fact that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the PTSD Network have spent lots of considerable resources, and particularly our tax dollars, to develop psychological first aid for natural disasters. They have the trainer certification program for first responders and a certificate program for lay people to provide initial ongoing therapeutic support and triage. There's even a mobile psychological first aid app for people who are victims of a natural disaster. You can look it up. You can put in psychological first aid in the App Store and you'll find it. Despite the fact that there are more citizens experiencing gunshot violence, there is no psychological first aid kit or psychological training resources for lay people or for community members who want to help others who experience gunshot violence. Mental health resources in the city of Chicago are very limited. So when we start talking about trauma-informed resources for, say, children, we know that children who have experienced any form of gunshot violence, that there's a 6-month waiting list. And we are in the middle of summer right now. So in our healing circles, we decided to use this as an opportunity to do a community needs assessment, to document what is needed from each of the stakeholders' perspectives, be they survivors, direct family members, direct witnesses, first responders, indirect witnesses, such as people within the community or the social network. And we also included members, we considered that there would be members of the larger community who may have felt some kinship with the survivors or direct family members, or simply be a member of the extended community because they care. It was also important to acknowledge that there may be many people who will have dual stakeholder participantship. Someone can be a multiple member of any of those stakeholder groups. For example, Philandro Castillo's partner was a survivor, a witness, and a family member, but she was also related to Devontae Wright. In the Healing Circles meetings, we started with what was the incident that started your activism, and in that moment, and in asking that question, it became very clear to us that each of the 12 people that were in the room with us were carrying the weight of a number of losses and across the board belonged to more than one stakeholder group. 12 people generated over 60 names. So our work with them changed simply to address the amount of grief and loss, the psychic pain that even these first responders, community members who are also activists, how much they too were carrying. So what's the big idea here? Personally, trying to provide psychological care and comfort while I think it's necessary is not necessarily my preferred place to be working. I would prefer to be laser focused on preventing violence and, more importantly, creating safe, nurturing communities where children and adults not only survive, but also thrive. To me, that means that we need to develop a different ecosystem, a society that has to value Black lives too, and brown lives. There's an interconnectedness between societal killings of children and children who are killed by individuals within the community via suicide or via accidental death. All of these unfortunate, tragic endings of a child's life or any life reflect how we value life, and especially our children. Our reactions or lack thereof to create a feedback loop to the child or to individuals in the community about the value of life and specifically the value of Black and brown life says something to each of us and to the community members. Black and brown people killed by police almost always face a physical death, but the second death is the destruction of character, the annihilation of human dignity that is used to justify their murder and contributes to a continued disparagement of the value of that life. Some of the reason I keep speaking about children and how children, we know that 115 children have been killed by police since 2015. Many of those, we don't have a government-focused or government-sponsored national database that looks at police killings. The Washington Post does that for us, and that's kind of a shame that the police are not able to monitor themselves, and they don't want to. The next big idea, there needs to be an attitude shift. We should design interventions, whether they are preventative or treatment after the fact. The intervention should be designed with the community residents having a central voice. So those who are most impacted, their voices need to be in the center of how that intervention is designed, in partnership, an attitude of let's do this with the community, as opposed to doing something for the community and to the community. It's a shifting, but a very important shift when you say you want to work hand in hand with the community and that they are equal or elevated partners in designing what the intervention will look like, having agency over self and community. Thirdly, there needs to be real community involvement that involves all stakeholders. An active question in the room should be, is there a group, a person, or an entity that should be in the room with us as we try to solve the group-defined problem? Everybody in and no one left out. So our healing circle work is not complete. We've committed, Michelle and I, to follow through and to make sure that our needs assessment and their voices get carried to whatever levels that we can. We are working with these activists to find the needs for themselves and the communities they serve. We hope to activate them and you who are listening to this to do a full court press to divert government funding to develop the psychological tools needed to address gun violence and to address creating the processes that would create safer, nurturing neighborhoods.
Dr. Blessman, thank you. What a thoughtful and thorough analysis. How you did that in 5 minutes, I don't know, but well done you.
Yep.
Let's go straight to Michael. You ready?
Yes. Well, the good thing is, I think what I'm going to say naturally builds off of Dr. Blessman. And I think I'll rearrange my comments to start with the dehumanization, primarily of Black and brown children, but and not just children, but Black and brown people. Yeah, and then talk about just the larger dehumanization that trickles over, because I think it's important that we remember a couple of things, that the dehumanization of Black and brown people is also a capitalist endeavor. And so the dehumanization of Black and brown people and other non-white people trickles over into other people who weren't originally considered white at one point and or are white but are a part of a class system that we're all a part of that does not necessarily view them as much of anything except poor. And I think when we begin to consider the ways that class and race go hand in hand, and I want to lift up Caste by Isabel Wilkerson as a great book for people who need to, get a nice grounding in that concept. She's not the only one that has talked about this, but she has written a monumental piece of work that I think beautifully talks about these ideas. That's most recent, honestly. I think it came out within the last 24 months, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it's important to remember that dehumanization.
Mike, I'm getting a little freeze on you.
That the dehumanization that this country put forward on Black and brown people primarily and other non-white groups extends out and spills over to everybody except a very small group of people. That we are actively participating in a system that robs many of us of our humanity, doesn't consider our humanity, and has taught us how to view ourselves even in a distorted fashion as it relates to our humanity. And that kind of framing is important to me because I'm gonna maybe say some things that could be considered a little provocative. And I don't mean to be a provocateur, it's just I think my politics kind of naturally put me in a place that could rub people in the wrong way. So I do want to put that out as a preface. I'm an abolitionist at core. I do not believe in a police militarized state for local neighborhoods, for state systems, for a federal government. It's not a fundamental core belief of how I believe we should be operating as a country. I live in a city where we had weapons turned on citizens this summer, and it ended up making the national news with a deep investigative story from the New York Times, because in Philadelphia, we had protesters on a highway who were trapped by law enforcement, tear gas, rubber bulleted, and while trying to get out of the way of this attack from the police. And then the ensuing activity afterwards of our local government officials, particularly the mayor's office and the managing director and the police department, was one of complete and total unfortunate untruths that only became centralized because it was documented and therefore could be literally confronted. I think we cross barriers and lines, and these are lines that get crossed regularly. So this is partly why I believe in abolition versus reform. We cross lines when we turn weapons on our citizens. We cross lines when we are willing to rubber bullet children. We cross lines when we are willing to use methods of weaponry that are banned in international warfare on our own citizens. And I would even argue, again, could be a bit of a provocatory moment. I don't necessarily know that I agree that these weapons should be used in war itself, right? I think there is an entire way that capitalism and dehumanization has organized ourselves to think about resources in a way that allows us to justify violence across a number of dimensions. And we have to sit with what that means in the 21st century and ask ourselves, how well has this served us? How well has it served us to invest as much money in Afghanistan as we did to have it be exactly where it is 20 years later and have the state of the lives of Black and brown citizens, the lives of poor rural white Americans, the lives of so many people in this country be no better than it was 20 years ago as well. We are sloshing around trillions of dollars and really just succeeding at death more than anything else else, whether it's domestic or international. And that's just something that we have to sit in, as uncomfortable as it is. So that dehumanization piece for me, as a bit of a design strategist, and I like to borrow from Disney on this one, an Imagineer, right? I believe in the imaginative faculty, and we've got to set the imaginative faculty free from its hijacking of these systems of dehumanization, et cetera. And then we have to use it to construct the world and the models that we want. From that perspective, and my work, I deal with a lot of systems redesign, reimagination, organizational cultural shifts, dealing with intersections of trauma theory and resilience theory and human development and diversity, equity, inclusion, racial equity, inclusion. Before it was hot button over the last year and a half, it's actually been kind of wild to be in my role and have the last 18 months play out the way that they have. There are two core things that are really important to me, and they get heady, but they are practical at the same time. One is this idea of epistemic justice, or this idea of like interrogating the epistemology behind these ideas. So epistemology is the study of how do you know what you claim to know? What is knowledge? And the justice part gets into these questions around who gets to say what is knowledge in a particular area? And more importantly to me, who gets to say what constructs and tools validate the form or the construct that we're calling a type of knowledge? Who gets to say what criminal justice is? Who gets to say what reform is, and who gets to validate its components? How do we get to validate those components? Who's at the table when we're doing all of that sense making, et cetera? So how do we know what we claim to know? Who gets to validate the tools that make the construct a thing, and who's a part of any of the journey in that whole space? To me is a real big question in this context. The other area is, what I call ontological sense making. So ontology is about how do constituent things and parts of a thing work together to function. So those two things go hand in hand. How do we know what we claim to know? Who gets to say what validates the thing that we're claiming to know? Who gets to say what tools and constructs matter? Who gets to say what data matters? Who gets to say what data are, right? Like that's a whole branch of stuff, because we throw out the lived experience. We throw out the fact that people are living through trauma that we can't put into an acute algorithm and make sense of when we're talking about, say, risk assessments, right? And who might reoffend. So there's a whole lot there to consider. And then the flip side of that is, how do these things all work together? If the world is rooted in dehumanization, you will never consider a very core set of base needs that I'm going to need as a Black male in this country to feel safe, to feel valued and honored. These larger systems are not built to hold that for Dr. Blessman, for Ed, for Chinese migrants, for Mexican migrant students. Like, it's just not built for that. And so the pieces that we have working in the context of justice, even police reform, that don't have to consider those experiential data points of people's real lives, and then can throw away any other qualitative data that could back up those experiences because there are no inputs for it. In terms of ontology and the pieces that are working together to try to deliver justice or to deliver protection, it's just missing so much and flawed. So we have to do the sense making around, like, how does messy dehumanization and these messy pieces together that we use to prop up this system, how do we expect their relationship with one another to produce well-being, to produce guardianship, to produce anything that is life and family affirming or sustaining? I think we are expecting vinegar to be sweet. So the question for me is not, well, I guess, what do we do in light of that to, make it all work? I'm like, well, maybe some of it's just not built to work. And so I appreciated that video you started with, and I'll end here. I appreciate that video you started with, which shows San Francisco working through this messy predicament that is centuries old. We are going to have to figure out new models. Some things are just going to be brand new. Some things might be reformed, but I think we're lying to ourselves, honestly, if we think we can reform the whole thing. Some things are going to have to go. And that's the abolition part of me that shows up in this space to do work. Like I worked on a project in Virginia where we train new recruits, right? And I said everything that a lot of what you're hearing here, I said to them, and then did presentations with them on adolescent development, trauma in the human brain, trauma in their brain, and not just adolescence, right? I've done work with the U.S. Attorney's Office of Eastern Pennsylvania, where we interviewed police officers as one part of a larger project focused all on youth homicide and adult homicide prevention and interventions and adult and youth recidivism. It's a public health initiative. I had no gun, no badge. That was never the goal. I didn't want to cross over into law enforcement, but this project was housed out of there through a grant from the Department of Justice called Project Safe Neighborhoods. And it was all based on the work, or we used as our foundational framework, the work of a psychiatrist named Dr. Sandra Bloom, who created something called the Sanctuary Model, which is an organizational cultural model focused on institutions, organizations, public, private, and not-for-profit, all in that space, or those spaces. How do they switch from being the traditional model of service delivery to one that is more trauma-informed, right? The Sanctuary Model she built for that. And we use that as our basis in the work. And part of that work included interviewing police officers because the team was developing training for them. And what was fascinating was how many officers off the record would talk to us about officer suicide. It was the first time that had ever come up for us. It was a volunteered moment in so many interviews that it stunned me. I had one person beg us to talk about this out loud and said, I went the year, I won't share that because I don't want to make it too personal, but I'll say this. There are years where very significant things happen to people that are about great, loving moments, right? You can think of people having babies, or people having their kid graduate from high school, or people getting married, right? So police officers are human and they're doing those things, and they're matching the amount of officer suicides that took place in the year that don't get spoken about with those activities. Like that came out a lot. And that was stunning to sit in and hear, because here I was going, wow, this system is so dehumanizing that we can't even focus on the largest threat to you in terms of your own safety, which is data says is officer suicide. More officers are lost to suicide than shooting from civilians and traffic incidents or accidents combined. And we got to sit in that. And we got to sit in the fact that there is no federal tracking around officer suicide, and that there are officers leaving the field to go into the nonprofit space to pick up this issue. There's one company, a gentleman started, I cannot remember its name off the top of my head. Its name is Andy O'Hara. I think it's called Badge of Life. But he was 24 years in the field and left to specifically focus on mental health resources, officer suicide, and bringing light to this issue. So I will end there, but go back to a core point. Dehumanization is spilling over. Dehumanization is primarily pointed at Black and brown people and other non-white groups of people who are a global majority, not a minority. We're just a minority here. We are being targeted with dehumanizing activities, policies, and procedures, but it's spilling over to everybody, including the police officers that are propagating, unfortunately because of the system, propagating those same things.
Mike, thank you. And Ed, you got a lot to follow on here.
I was only going to just let Michael's words resonate for a minute, this theme of dehumanization. And I'd like to bring this back. If we could pull up the deck, Kevin, for just two visuals. I'd like to bring this back to cause and effect. The way that police officers conduct themselves and the dehumanization of those they're called to protect comes from the way they're educated or trained currently. Let's go down 2 slides if we could, Kevin, please. So this is a phrase that comes out of several schools of thought. Its origins are in Attic Greece, in Plato, but these words were spoken in this form by Dr. King, as he was examining the question, how do we relate to each other as human beings where there is conflict? So if we go to the next slide, Kevin, just to provoke your thinking, colleagues, and we would invite questions and thoughts and challenges here. The guardian archetype that we've developed, now coming on 7 years in the field, calls upon different capacities of peace officers as human beings. Instead of power and authority, intellect and social dexterity. Intellect and social dexterity to evoke the creativity of the peace officer when she is standing in conflict. And this relies upon anchor points in ethics, virtue, and dignity. What is it to conduct yourself virtuously? And to see your community members, whatever they're going through, with honor and dignity. One police officer in Philadelphia said to us as we were trying to confront this very issue in every single city we've gone to, this buried issue of police suicide is so tragically almost suppressed by the rank and file. I would ask you to remember that in the wake of the insurrection on 6 January, 5 Capitol police officers committed suicide. And the information that we have tells us that it was because of their sense of failure to protect those they were called to protect. So the last idea we would invite you to think about is, what do we evoke in our peace officers now? It is power and authority, as opposed to their intellect and their heart and their social dexterity. And that's what a multi-year course of study, not training, brings forth in the guardian archetype. So I'll stop there and see if people have questions, or if Michael or Patricia have things they want to add.
Let me encourage Maite and Stephen and Yaswina, if you've got questions, just jump in, or if you've got comments, thoughts, provocative things to say, feel free to jump in. Sarah.
Well, I'll jump in. I love to be provocative. And I apologize, I've been sort of having to do something else at the same time as some of this, but I did want to approach this at a different angle. It is about police training specifically. And the image that comes to mind in the typical police department is a young rookie rides around in the police car with somebody who's been around for 4 or 5 years. And in doing so, absorbs the culture of the existing police department, which, as all of you have brilliantly shown, is problematic. And so this young, motivated individual who's at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of authority is getting his learning from somebody much older who's already been absorbed into the culture. And it reminds me of a story of a retired police officer here in Marin, whose name I won't mention, but some of you I think may know him, who's African-American and was on the police force down in Southern California. And one night pulled over someone who was weaving or whatever, and turned out she was probably a DUI. And to kind of cut the story short, it turned out that he was patrolling in a white neighborhood, and she complained because she was a big deal to the police chief, and the officer got severely criticized, basically told, "You're not supposed to do that to these people," mainly white people, in this neighborhood. You're supposed to give them a warning and let them go. And he had written out a ticket. And it's just an example that if you don't get with the music of the culture of the police department, which is sort of, I agree with those of you who've spoken, is often rotten to the core, you're not going to make it. And that very well may contribute to the suicides statistic that one of you mentioned.
Thank you, Steve. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, go on.
Let me just close the circle here. by giving something analogous, and what we've tried to do unsuccessfully so far. I do a lot of bike safety work. My daughter was sadly killed on her bike 12 years ago yesterday, and my life now is around street safety. And at a hearing in San Francisco, as a result of a truck crash that killed a cyclist, and the police had blamed the cyclist for the crash, and it turned out that the truck, when the Bike Coalition found a video that the police hadn't even looked for, the truck was at fault. And there was a huge hearing in San Francisco. It was a really big deal. 47 people testified that they had had this blame the victim thing from the police. Now, it's totally different from the racial component, which is so central to all of this, but it's its own culture. The police hate cyclists. You're turning left at an intersection and there's a crash, and they come in, they say, what the hell were you doing in the intersection? And that's exactly where they're entitled to be. The culture of the San Francisco Police Department is get bicycles out of here. We don't want them. So my argument and question is, if we don't change the whole culture, as opposed to looking at individual police officers and their humanity, which they have, most of them coming in, we're not going to get anywhere. And our solution on the bike thing, which nobody's accepted yet, is to get them to do bike patrol, every one of them for 2 or 3 weeks a year. So here's my question to you. Why not have police officers without uniforms on drive around in target neighborhoods with people of color to experience what they're feeling as they drive around constantly checking to see if they're going to get pulled over for a taillight. Maybe even they're in a car with a taillight that's busted, and sure enough, somebody's going to pull them over. Unless officers experience what people of color or any other culture are going through and stop being this closed silo that just talks to itself, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. Sorry I went on, but you invited me to come.
That was not going on, Steve. That was making an argument and making it clearly. And I'm curious to hear where we can go to incorporate that idea that culture is so pivotal.
I'll offer a thought about this. There's a book, Arresting Communication. It's a book about how police officers are conventionally taught and then how are creatively taught to communicate, this idea of social dexterity. Culture is set from the top. William Bratton has a take on this, and what he talks about is that the hierarchy of police departments must end. They take a very militaristic role of hierarchy and chain of command, all of which are battlefield gestures. In community, the police officers don't have the luxury of supervision. They are often called upon to be the leader of a conversation in a heated moment where de-escalation has to be the fundamental gesture, not power and authority, but this social dexterity and creativity and problem solving, which requires a whole different kind of learning. And the culture that we have found when we've achieved this kind of shift, and it's a 10-year process, and it is not done by just changing the manual for the academy. But the cultural issue that we see requires a level of honesty that we're sometimes not willing to agree to. In communities of color, they have lived for generations in apartheid. And if we don't name it that way, we cannot possibly heal from it. So the culture has to shift from one that says we are imposing order to one of curiosity and community building. Because the police, those of you who were with us during the lessons of the Chauvin verdict, my brilliant colleague Mackenzie Mako talked about the history of policing as creating order for the benefit of the wealthy. We have an opportunity at this inflection point in our society to reimagine the culture of policing, but we only get to guardianship if we're willing to evoke the social dexterity and the creative hearts of peace officers in the academy, which will weed out people who have an authoritarian personality and are there to carry a gun.
I'll jump in as well and say that I'm with you, Stephen, on the fact that culture has to change. Addressing individual officers, while I think is important from a legal precedence, and like we have to begin to set legal precedents that this behavior is not okay and will be met with a full, attunement to the law, and honoring the humanity of the folks that have been directly accosted by law enforcement. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're starting to see glimpses of that as a possibility over the last year. But it's so new that we'll see what happens, right? But I think there's merit there. But to your point, it's not a panacea. It's not going to take care of everything. And so from a systems perspective, I don't rely on non-systems experts, and that expertise doesn't have to come from just books. But I think we have to look at people that understand the complexity of systems, but also look at people that understand specific systems that they have been entrenched in and grew up in or worked in for years, and begin to have some really specific dialogues around certain what the systems, the academic world will call stocks and flows. But not to be too academic here, we can talk about inputs, outputs, and like naturally occurring phenomenon that like with the wrong inputs with that naturally occurring phenomenon will create chaos. Arguably, that's what's happening with the climate right now, right? There are some things that are just naturally occurring, but boy, oh boy, with our choices as human beings, we have done a doozy. And now those two things combining are creating lots of chaos for rural communities, for the middle of Philadelphia with flooding. Like it's wild what's happening. So in that context here with systems, we got to look at things like recruitment. Why are we recruiting soldiers directly out of war to police neighborhood? Like, that's crazy. I shouldn't say the word crazy. Actually, I'm working on ableist language, so I'm going to check myself. That is not okay. That is a bizarre choice when the goal is supposedly safety of neighborhoods, that you take folks who are literally coming off of tours in areas that our country destabilized and now has to go in with brute force to try to bring some sense of order. We're bringing that to North Philadelphia and Center City, Philadelphia. We're bringing that to Chicago, where what's really the problem there is not the fact that Black people are violent, because that narrative does not have enough data over the last century to back it up. Even the data that we can pull on now really is at the feet of record disinvestment in neighborhoods that go back centuries, and for groups of people that go back centuries. And so people had to adjust and make life happen for themselves to survive. And really, we do have the sneaky intervention of government in the neighborhood, seeding the kinds of activities that would then lead to gun violence becoming a phenomenon over the last 30 to 40 years. So this trend around data for Black violence in a neighborhood that's causing the police to show up the way that they are, that's new. And the police have acted like this prior to that. Going back to things like sundown towns, right? Like I think there's a history here that keeps getting lost and forgotten and romanticized. So how we recruit, who we're recruiting matters. right? It matches the end of keeping sundown town mentality in the 21st century under new language. It does not match the idea of public safety for the sense of shared humanity. And so we have to be very clear on what we want the system's output to be, to then look at these system-like inputs or systems level inputs like recruitment to then really make sense. And this goes back to my whole thing around epistemology and ontology. We got to make sense of what's going on and be like, oh, we're adding 2 and 2 expecting 25, but 2 and 2 is still going to be 4. And we need to do something about that. So I think, again, just recruitment as one example of these systems level inputs that start higher up in the process of dehumanization through law enforcement that can make a shift. But again, I'm going to go back to my provocateur nature for a moment and go, I still question, do we have the time on our side based on what we are beginning to understand about humanity, about the body and humans as systems and complex creatures that are social in nature? There's just a lot of things combining and stacked on top of each other that we really just might. I think this is where defund the police resonates with people, even if they can't explain it. We know we need money in other areas for livelihood and sustainability. We know that's a thing, and we have to begin to reimagine budgeting and city budgets that are built for life and built for sustainability and not built as a response to death or potential death, particularly Black and brown death, whether that's through violence at the hands of the state, through weapons, violence at the hands of the state through not properly and adequately housing and feeding people. There are so many ways that violence has taken place. Redlining still being a thing. Like, we got so much going on record that we really have to figure out, what does budgeting, city budgeting, mean in the context of a public health frame around well-being? And I think we've got to look at police budgets if we're going to have that dialogue.
Dr. Blessman, I see you leaning forward.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of, we're covering a lot of different pieces to the ecosystem, or the system that creates for or doesn't create nurturing environments. What struck me though is we talk about, now Michael brought up the suicide rate of police. And, Chicago has the highest, Chicago police have a higher suicide rate than, I think it's 60, last stat I looked at was 60% higher than the national average of police departments across the nation. So we're talking about a lot of impaired people who are out there policing. Now, if my colleague is impaired in some way, my ethical responsibility is to address that with my colleague and, encourage them to get some treatment. If a doctor is impaired, it's part of the ethical standards of doctors that they should talk to their colleague about getting some treatment, or they might get referred to the board for some help and some care. But we don't have that kind of system in place for policemen. Maybe because they're not licensed professionals, because I understand that psychologists are licensed, doctors are licensed, and so there's a whole piece around that. But yes, it is about, who do we recruit into the police force, but also what happens to the care and feeding of the policeman's soul once they are in the police force? What is happening on that level? And I don't want all of our conversation to be on the police, because they're not the only ones who are in the center of the stakeholder circle. Okay. So certainly there are it's interesting that, we're focusing on police, but, what about the police people on the other side? Be it, yes, we do need to talk about the police and what they need in order to more effectively do their job. But we also need to talk about the people who are the survivors, the direct witnesses, and what it is that they need in order to move forward. in order for communities to create safe environments. There are a number, I've seen several reimaginations of the police in conjunction with communities, and many attempts to try to create ways in which the police can work with the community and all the stakeholders to create safer environments and reduce some of the crime or reduce killings. I can tell you from my own experience here in Chicago that I know of at least one really good program where they had all the stakeholders. They implemented a pilot program in 5 of the highest high crime districts in the city of Chicago. The program was developed by a woman who was a police officer. She had a doctorate degree. She was a member of the community. She had multiple identities. So she had she had an idea and a perspective that was born from these various places that she lived. And plus she was in a community that was a high violence community. Somehow she managed to get this pilot study implemented across 5 districts in the city of Chicago. And it was a resounding success. Now, I can tell you part of the reason why it didn't get implemented citywide, because one mayor came in and said, well, it don't have my name on it. It's not going anywhere because I don't have my name on it. Okay. Somebody else, the new police chief came in and he wanted to have his name on it. I mean, literally, he wanted to take her name off of it.
I'm sorry to laugh so hard.
I'm literally. Okay, so it's, sometimes what happens or does not happen has more to do with who gets to get credit, who gets to be, as Michael talked about epistemology, who gets to determine what's just, what's success. How do you define who gets to, it is that level of craziness. In the meantime, every week, my pastor is telling everybody, well, this number of people got killed, this number of children got killed this weekend, and this number of people we get the report, on every Monday morning, we get the report. How many people got killed, how many children were shot, how many children were killed, and then how many people were shot over the weekend. And they're still, they're still in a pissing contest, basically. The police, the police departments, the city, all that. And, so it, on some level, I'm sure that creates to everybody's level of frustration about why we can't seem to make movement in this area. Because, we know that there are systems and processes that do work. And that's the frustration more than anything else. Because at the end of the day, the people who are at the center of all of this, the people who are actually being policed, what they have to say is not given any kind of weight at all. Yeah. And even if it's proven to be successful, will it be implemented on, and how do we get it implemented on a much broader basis?
Yeah, what we're talking about here is community voice and this important concept of legitimacy. Yes. Where does the social license to police come from? How do we imbue policing activity with legitimacy?
Right.
It has to be devolved from the community saying, yes, we consent. And right now it's the opposite.
Correct.
And one of the most powerful things we've done in police academy transformation is to bring in people who are the traumatic survivors of police violence to talk to cadets. That has had, we've seen two effects. That pushes certain people out of the academy because they didn't sign up for this. They signed up to be top down, imposition of will and control. And we've seen it, to go to Michael's point about recruiting, where do we draw cadets from? In the city of Atlanta, we've focused the recruiting efforts and rebuilt the outreach and recruiting efforts around social workers and teachers. And if we could bring up, Kevin, slide 6 from the deck that I sent you, I want to address this question of budgeting, just to be provocative and hopefully invite the colleagues who are here with more questions and maybe provoke your thinking. But if you think about the population, where police come from, social workers and teachers. One of the models that we've developed, we piloted this in Oakland and it's working elsewhere. We're just now in San Antonio, Texas, is to take police budgets and reorient them to mental health and de-escalation. 50% of the budget focused there. 25% of the budget on community engagement and hearing the voice to create legitimacy. And then we're always going to need cops and robbers. There are bad people who set up meth labs and try to addict children and are human traffickers. And we need that. But that's when you have a licensure program to earn the right to carry deadly force. Because I think police in America, to just build on Michael's provocative nature, and I'll offer my own here, I think they have surrendered the right to use deadly force because they've shown they cannot use it with judiciousness.
Correct.
So this is just one model. We at the lab are not experts. We are still learning. We approach this with a great deal of humility, but this is one way to reimagining budgeting. And this is a classroom of Minneapolis police officers that we were talking to about, and we get resounding support from police departments when we talk about this. Because right now, the current model puts targets on their backs. So
What's also interesting about the current model is that there, and the clip in San Francisco that Kevin started with points this out, and I've heard this in Philly. They're not trained for half of those calls. I had one officer say, I feel like we're just partly DHS hotline getting these calls. And we show me like, I don't know what to do. And it's like, and we feel bad because it's like, this person didn't do anything wrong. I don't know what to do. And then somebody expects me to do a thing. And so we kind of do a thing. And I remember scratching my head at that going, wow, this is just like such bad design, like top to bottom. And so I appreciate the idea of, that reallocation of the budget. I'll add my provocateur nature on top of yours now, Ed. And I go, yeah, I agree with the numbers to an extent. Except I want to look at, well, what's the bottom line number? Because if we're still splitting up $700 million that way, I'm like, no. I'd rather just outsource, right, an entire chunk of that to the proper people and professionals that really can do that work. And then if we got to focus on, because I hear you on the meth labs for sure, right? Philadelphia has one of the, if at one point had like the largest open air drug market on the East Coast, or the heroin market, I think it was specifically on the East Coast. We have like $10 million corners in certain parts of the city because of the drug trade. That's a lot to handle. And communities are being ravaged by this issue, top to bottom. There are parts of Philadelphia that legitimately look like scenes out of The Purge. I mean, it's made its way onto like Instagram and social media fame, and picked up in the country. Even some years ago, Dr. Oz, I believe, came and did an entire special on the opioid epidemic and crisis in Philadelphia as indicative of the crisis across the nation. So this has been hot button for a while, but we still can't wrap our arms around it. So to an extent, you do need something to address the levels that are nefarious in that space, while not addressing that in a way that completely kind of like runs a big train over all these folks just suffering from addiction. right? Like we have to be able to go in with a fine tooth comb and a scalpel to try to really figure out what is what should be where, who should be doing what. Because if we, if you give a 3-year-old a hammer and ask that 3-year-old to do some sophisticated nail removal with the reverse side of the hammer, and you also have a bunch of glass in the room, I mean, you're going to get what you're going to get. And that to me has been our approach on all of this. And I'm just like, at a certain point, when are we going to go, this is just wasted funds?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you on that. We know that a large percentage, I think the video talked about the 25% of the police killings are actually that 25% of the people that are getting killed are people who are our most vulnerable citizens. Not just children, but also people with mental health issues, people with some kind of speech disorder. So think about people who might be deaf, or a person who might have had a stroke and has some kind of aphasia, or or might be developmentally delayed in some way, autism, Asperger's, somebody that's having a psychotic break, or experiencing a manic or bipolar episode, something like that. We know that mental health issues, that the people that are getting killed is not just Black and brown people. Yes, that to a large extent it is, but also, I was amazed at the percentage of people who are also mentally challenged in some way or communicative challenge in some way that are also getting killed by police. We don't have a means of being able to have people come in emergency situations where a person is having a mental health challenge. I've had way too many calls where I've had to actually walk people through, like I can think of many situations where I've had to walk Black parents through, their child is having a psychotic episode or some kind of break. It's a Black male, and have to walk them through how to be calm and how to talk to the police so that your child don't get killed as you try to get your child help, just to get them to the hospital where they can get some help. Now here's the parent who's freaking out, understandably, because their child, and it's like, it's almost, we're asking the parent or this person to be more in charge than the police, okay, who should be trained at least to stay calm or rational, but can't, because they're hyped up or whatever, because maybe they're impaired because they got their own PTSD issues. Maybe they're impaired because they got an alcoholism problem. Maybe they're impaired because they're feeling depressed, suicidal, whatever. So you've got an impaired police officer that you got to manage along with this impaired person that you're trying to get help for. I mean, it becomes too much just even for the average citizen. So I agree with you, Michael. There needs to be a separate entity. And if that means we have to rethink our budgets about what is needed in our community. If we need people who are going to handle, who we know a certain percentage of the calls are going to be folks who are having a mental health crisis, then why don't we do like Amsterdam does? They have the mental health ambulance. They have the special distress squad that comes in to handle those kinds of emergencies. I totally get it. And I don't want to have to counsel another parent again on how to stay calm, because the police might kill your kid when they come into your home to try to work with your child who's having a psychotic break or having some kind of mental health issue. That's crazy. That to me is crazy.
Yes. And it's making me think about something Ed said before about, and this is the hard part around justice reimagining at large, right? Because it's not just the police. It's law enforcement at large, which includes the prosecutors. It includes probation. It includes parole boards. It includes COs and the entire system that houses folks that are, introduced into this carceral state. And so we've got to really think about all those places. And, you know, there's words that I've been accustomed to using. We all have, right? Good, bad. They're steeped in deservingness lenses. And we even have these questions that get early presented into larger stories that we'll hear from across the country. Well, what did they do? Right. So think about who is deserving of certain types of treatment because of a thing they did, and often in an unspoken way because of who they are, where they live, how they identify, their parentage, right? Like there's so many things, both conscious and unconscious, that are combining for us to think about or make sense of whether or not somebody deserved the treatment that they got. So when a young person, I'll give a couple of quick examples that really make me go like, oh. When a young person is killed, regardless of who did it, why, or what, when we go to the next statement around, or the next thing that comes up in the story that's centered around, well, they did sell drugs, they did use weed, they did, it's just like, so the justification of the loss of life is based on like really teenage stuff that teenagers across the board, regardless of race. And
I'm getting triggered right about now. I'm getting triggered, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because we just dealt with that with the murder of Adam Toledo, a Hispanic young male young boy who was 13, who was killed by the police with his hands up in the air. Okay, and it was incredible to me that, you know, the first thing that was out of, you know, the inability for some people, major heads of major social service agencies, who were unable to see beyond, to see this child as that this was a tragic loss of life, to be able to empathize with the parents at all, not even able to go there. Their first reaction was, well, he was a gangbanger. That was the first reaction, as opposed to thinking about, he was 13, he was a kid who was having some difficulties at home, difficulties in school. Yes, he was being recruited by possibly a gang person. But we also know that he comes out of a community where there are no investments in no investments in social service or social services or programming or any kinds of activities for middle school kids and high school kids. And trust me, the drug dealers and the gangbangers got a program for black and brown children, and they're investing in them, but we're not. Okay. And so, I mean, there's just the minute they get into, well, he's a gangbanger, it's like it shuts down any kind of discussion about the quality of life of the kids in that community, or who even gets to be considered a victim, so to speak.
Absolutely right. Who gets to be, and that's the tricky part in all of this stuff. And that gets into those words like good or bad. And when we get into deserving, because I come, again, as a abolitionist in my philosophy, I think we should be minimally locking people up. And I think we have to qualify what that means, right? I don't believe in the death penalty, right? Like there's just some core things that I don't believe in, but that doesn't mean I don't believe in safety and the idea of sustaining wellness and investing in wellness. And what does it mean when there are challenges to that based on a number of inputs and factors? So there's I'm going to bring up a program called Operation Peacemaker Fellows or Peacemaker Fellowship. It started in Richmond, California. I believe it was Richmond, California, either Richmond or Stockton, California. But it started in California, spreading around the country. They target the shooters that typically don't get picked up, because the police know who these folks are. And cities tend to know who these folks are. They target this group and offer them a fellowship for them to, it's a paid fellowship where folks are getting mental health supports, they're getting job training. I mean, everything that we in our deservingness lens are like, people should be, and you should, and you need to turn your life around. They've literally incentivized it. And then we'll give them more money if they just keep it up for another 6 months. I don't know exactly when the money runs out, but you can get a decent enough living or salary off of engaging in this program. And if you partner that with other things that we see in the workforce development world, for example, that might pay you very little bits of money to get trained and blah, 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 because I think those programs are all designed poorly for who they're targeting. But this income to supplement that and help you invest in your mental health, et cetera, this is a great opportunity to target some of the hardest to reach folks who are not just like, I'm trying to deal drugs to ruin America. But like that's like the caricature we have of people. And it's like, yeah, he might be 28 and selling drugs, but he probably was the 13-year-old like that young man you just talked about, Dr. Blessman, and there was no intervention or a thing. And luckily they didn't get killed by the police, but they are where they're at. So at what point do we go, who is deserving of love, of support, right? What does that mean for us as a country to adopt budgets that undergird that, particularly when there is data to back that up as a thing that can work? Does that mean we won't be violent? No, humans are violent. And by we, I mean humans, not Black people. Let's be clear. Humans are violent by nature, but we're not violent to the point where we need a carceral police state the way that America has organized it. The data behind that doesn't really exist. We are stretching things and infusing narratives that don't fully exist. So, and I'll end here, the narrative around Black people being violent started in the late 1800s, 1900s, had a whole lot to do with Jim Crow and movies. I mean, you've all probably seen the 13th. Right. It's there. That narrative has existed forever, and there was never data to back that up.
Right. Right.
So I see a hand raised there from Maite Duran. Maite, did you have something to contribute?
First of all, thank you so much for the invite, and thank you for the incredible conversation. I think a lot of what has been said has resonated with me. I do my work with the Latino community, Latinx folks in San Rafael, California. And with my work, with young people, we relearn or focus our attention also on the wisdom of our ancestors. And in every kind of topic. And so this is one thing that or topic where we talk about ourselves and the safety, kind of weighing what is safety, the safety approach of the systems that we're talking about, and maybe the safety as it was considered in our ancestral communities. And in our ancestral communities everywhere in the world, whether it be in the Americas or Africa or Europe, the person was at the center and looked at in the philosophies and everything were looked at, catering to the life and affirmation of that person. And so to us, I think that there is a concept coming up from the Andean culture, especially from Ecuador, and it's the concept of sumac causai, meaning the good living, not good living in the sense of acquiring things, but good living in the sense that human beings had to be the center of life affirming policies, and also considering where they are, all the relations, meaning Mother Earth and other beings that are equal of value to all of us. And so now if we are kind of translating that wisdom into nowadays, yes, we need to not, destroy our mother, our only home, our mother, our common mother, Earth. And you can see how capitalism has done a great job of, destroying and making us think that, getting things is what we need to show off for a good life. But nowadays, also we think that in our communities that are, suffering from all these kinds of illnesses, and not only illnesses of the body, but of the heart as well. We think safety comes from, having a decent life, a roof over your head, good food, a job, and dignity and respect, because dignity is an essential need, like food, because it's food for your soul. If you are mistreated and treated in an undignified manner, you are abandoning your humanity. Or you are made to abandon your humanity, because then you are responding in kind, in that undignified kind to the others. The person who was mistreated at work comes over, fights with the partner. The partner yells at the kid kicks the dog. So life and affirmation of life and dignity is at the center of it all. That's what I just wanted to say. And thank you so much for illuminating all these points that you've been talking about.
Thank you, Maite.
Thank you for sharing.
I'm going to have to look up that Andean concept. Not that I need to hear more because you explained it, but I want to learn more in general. Thank you.
It is beautiful too. So much I would love to say in that ancestral piece. I've taken up space, so I'm gonna mark it. I'll come back to in like 10 minutes.
Well, Sarah Turner or Yasmina, are you being quiet because you're soaking this all in? I'm sure you are, but if you have anything you want to ask or say or do, feel free to jump in, okay?
I have a couple of thoughts. So much of what we've talked about has been about the response to an engagement, some kind of a call the police get and they go out. Something's happened already. And I'm thinking about the relationship that I used to think that the police had in a healthy relationship with their community, where they knew the people. And a lot of these things were known and prevented, rather than waiting till something happens and then you have to call and get the police to come and fix it or do whatever they're going to do. And it reminds me of what I've been reading about in what's happened in a community in Marin that is primarily Black and brown, and they complained that what the sheriff was doing was sending the new officers to their community to be trained. That they got all the new ones came. They were trained there, and I think also in the Canal area also. And they said, but we just get to know them, and then they're gone. They're sent someplace else. We never get to really know them. And so what kind of a relationship can they have with the police officers if they're They just come there to be trained. And the sheriff, responded to that saying, well, that's where the incidents happen. We send them where the incidents are. So that again says, what are they thinking about those communities if they think of them only as, high crime areas where we have to send people who have to learn how to handle those kinds of situations. It just seemed wrong to me. It seemed like it was, saying something about those communities that was, as you say, dehumanizing them, and also not training your new officers in the kind of skills that they really needed. So that's what I've been thinking about.
It's interesting. In my lifetime, I've never had a moment where I thought the police were friendly, were kind, had my best interest at heart. I knew they were who I needed to call if something, and I'm going to put needed in air quotes, needed to call when something bad, also in air quotes, happened. But that was it. That was it. I was 13 when I got roughed up by cops, who then brought me to my home as opposed to the police station because my wrists were swollen and my face was swollen. And they brought me to my mother, and what they talked about was them feeling threatened. And my mother was confused because she's like, he's 13. What was so threatening about him? Well, I thought he might reach for my gun, and I thought this and that. And by that point, I tried to pop off, but my mother silenced me. So I sat there because I knew, I was like, bro, you're lying. Like, you don't know who I am. I'm in choir. And this is not about deserving this. This is about the profile you're painting with the boy that's standing in front of you. I didn't get into fights at school. I got in one fight my entire life in school. Right? So this profile he was painting of me to my mother, she was just like, bro, that's not even true. He's a theater kid who does choir and all this other stuff. What are you talking about? He's not violent. And not that theater kid couldn't be violent, and not that even if he was violent, it justifies you doing what you did, but the person you're legitimately describing is not the young man that is standing here in front of either of us, right? And so, what did I do? I told him not to grab me. He came on, there were cops called to the school bus. It was a late bus coming home from middle school. The cops got called because there was a fight in the back of the bus. Well, semi-fight in the back of the bus, but really people were getting on the bus driver. The bus driver was like, I can't. And so he called the cops. I'm not even going to say it's right or wrong. I'm just going to say he called the cops. I sat there listening to my Lauryn Hill Miseducation of Lauryn Hill CD. It had just come out, had my little Discman. And I was like, I didn't do nothing. I'm sitting by myself. I knew all those folks. They were friends, but I wasn't involved. And because I'm tall, the cop just kind of zeroed in on me as one of the people who needed to get removed. And I was like, I didn't do anything. And he was like, you need to get up. So I was like, all right, whatever. I'm not going back and forth with you. I went to grab my bag. He grabs me and was like, you don't need your bag. I said, well, you don't need to touch me. And I can get my book bag because I'm bringing my bag with me. And he was like, you can leave your bag. So he took his hand off. I went back to grab my bag and he grabbed me again. And I pulled back. I said, there's no reason for you to touch me, bro. I haven't even done anything. I'm just getting off the bus and I'm 13. I went to grab my bag and he grabbed me that time. But like bear grabbed me. And so my natural reaction was to do that. And when I moved back to clear myself, I just got attacked. And when getting the cuffs on my arm, he squeezed them tighter. He hit my head going into the door. Like, he was a jerk.
Right.
13 years old. There was no reason for any of it. And people were telling me he didn't even do anything. He wasn't in the fights and he didn't even care. I think about that story a lot for myself when I think about this stuff, because I'm like, what was he trained to see? Because he clearly didn't see a 13-year-old boy. Like, that just was not... That wasn't there. That wasn't even really there. So I've never had an experience where I've seen them coming to us in any format of like, I'm here to be nice. Like, it's just, so here to you. Right. It's never been a thing.
Yeah. No policeman is your friend.
Yeah. I'd like to pick up on that thread, and I'm noticing the hour here, and we're sort of getting into the home stretch. I want to build on something that Michael said and connect it to Patricia's idea. This is a system. It isn't just about the police, the prosecutors, the parole officers, the way that incarceration is viewed, the percentage of our population that is incarcerated. This is a systemic problem. And I'd like to bring it down to citizen action. You know, at the lab, we have a bias towards action. What can you do about this? And I'd like to invite, you know, as Kevin will know, as some of you will know, I have a great deal of affection for Marin because my misspent high school years were experienced there. And it has a lot to recommend it and a lot of problems. But I think as citizens and activists, the voice that we can bring is really at the county level for an experience of policing that is fundamentally a different set of gestures.
Right.
I'll offer you an example that you can look at and just quickly tell a story about Sunnyvale, which this is something that we learned when McKinsey and my colleague and I were rooting around for some academy content. The city of Sunnyvale down in the South Bay disbanded its police force in 1950 after the killing of a Chinese immigrant by police. And they began then, and they continue to this day, cross-training fire department and police officers into the public safety force, PSF. And I'd invite you to think about the reaction that you have or that a child of color has when a squad car is patrolling versus a fire truck pulling up to put out a fire in the home where you live. They have etched away that boundary. And these people who show up, they wear brown uniforms. They don't carry sidearms. They have a very small percentage of their budget, narrowly identified. They have a certification program for the cops and robbers bit, but they show up differently. And they are trained in this social dexterity that runs the gamut from social worker to de-escalation to empathy to this kind of curiosity about the person they're encountering. Because in the field, there is no supervision. You are charged with care. And that set of gestures, I think, that they use in Sunnyvale has a lot to recommend it. And as citizens, when you go to your county board of supervisors and you insist on a transformation, when you go to the ballot box, when you show up at the candidate debates, our dear friend Adam McGill is in the race for sheriff, and his platform is very well considered, founded on the President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which is part of where this idea of warriors to guardians comes from.
Yes, yes. I have a lot of my notebook now filled up with notes. Most of the big words came from Mike, you know, the multi-syllabic words, but I salute him for that and thank you. I do wonder what, if anything, Sarah or Maite or Yasmina, you can tell us you might carry away from this as an action item or an idea for an action item, if something occurs to you.
Well, I know that in Mill Valley there is there's an organization called MV Free, which I joined, and they have a team that's working with the police to try to modify, you know, what kind of behaviors and procedures they have. So I think one of the things I want to do is get more familiar with what they're doing, and so when it comes time for me to cast my vote, I know why I'm voting for whom, and so that's one of the actions that I take away is that I need to do more than read the newspaper, which I do, you know, always, and I get a lot of information from it about what's going on in the policing in this area, but I can learn more.
And, you know, without belaboring this, I'm wondering, Ed, do you want to go for a little roundup to finish, you know, some last thoughts from everybody, or?
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. I just want to express thanks again to you, Kevin, and to Patricia and Michael for the the very energetic conversation, to the colleagues for joining. I guess my end note would just be to come back to this idea of what our expectation is of police academies. Ask for copies of the cadet training manual. Look at what they say, and let's think about cause and effect. In those manuals, there are profiles of people of color. Expect certain behavior from Black people. And the language that I've seen is shocking sometimes, but these are public records, and our ability to influence our society for the better, to build what we at the lab call the well-being economy, depends on us being willing to wade in, and as Brother John Lewis said, get in the way. And standing in the way of police academy training that creates this hierarchical, authoritarian sense of control is corrosive. It destroys lives. It ruins children's ability to be children and to have a childhood. And it lessens all of us. So let's maybe ennoble ourselves by expecting more, interrogating those manuals for training, and talk about this idea that, the gesture of a peace officer as a teacher, as a therapist, as a curious learner in a moment of crisis, as one officer said to me in Denver one time when we were doing some academy work, I encounter people on my shift on the worst day of their lives. And that takes a kind of commitment and courage that should be cultivated in the direction of goodness, dignity, and honor, and not hierarchy, control, and punishment. So I'll invite us to think about that as we turn to the season of fall and think about how we can renew our society the way the earth renews itself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm hopeful that we can make change in Marin. I think I started this by saying we have a long way to go. Marin is in trouble in a lot of ways. And what I am taking away from this is the notion that as much as it would be great to have a leader who will move us forward in a better direction, if we can get these ideas in front of more people and get more heads nodding, then regardless of whether there's a leader, there's going to be enough of us nodding and saying, yes, let's change, let's be better, to make a difference. So thank you for giving me those ideas and the encouragement and the words, the long words especially, to help make those heads nod.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Blessman or anyone want to say anything before we head off to, you guys are all on like East Coast time. You're way past cocktail hour.
Good time.
Absolutely. And Michael more so than I, but I'm going to let Michael have the last word. I just want to say that thank you to this audience. Thank you, Kevin, for using this platform to talk about this very important issue. And as we think about how we might want to reimagine policing, it's really about how we reimagine, how to reimagine creating safe environments, nurturing environments, fulfilling environments for children and communities to live in, and creating it, the intentionality there. And then creating the political will and the desire and harnessing that to make sure that we get to the outcomes that we want and that people, all of humanity, deserve to have. Let's go there. Let's not be afraid to think big and to think outside of the box and to think creatively.
Well said. Just piggybacking on that, I think Maite's comments are spot on about ancestral wisdom. I often think about the wisdom of design that our ancestors have left us. If we choose to view them as such designers, they've designed policy, they design societies, they design processes for so many things. And, you know, one of the nuances of systems theory, if you change one part of the system, other parts of the systems, this gets into that ontology thing, multiple syllable words, but it gets into that ontology thing. If you change one part of the system, the other parts are going to start to shift too, because they have to. There's no, like, you can't do anything about that. Shift for good, bad, better, or worse, you know, that's a different question, but there is going to be a shift. And to Dr. Blessman's point around reimagining all of society really is what we're bringing forward. It's not just that law enforcement isn't working. There are so many things not working, right? And they are fueling and feeding each other. And our ancestors across the globe, there's a lot of wisdom that we are just leaving by the wayside. What's a society like? Well, what does law enforcement mean for a society that is regularly planning and budgeting for 7 generations at a time in their consideration? I don't even know, right? I would love to sit in 2 years of those thought experiments, right? And that's just one indigenous culture in the Americas that had an approach. And we could look at so many. If you go to the continent of Africa, the Dagara tribe, it's written up in a book by a scholar and indigenous shaman from the Dagara tribe named Patricia Jones-Blessman. In his book, The Healing Wisdom of Africa, he talks about the approach, the design and approach of youth development that their people take on. And they literally term it in English, the equivalent is inviting the genius out. And it's a fascinating process on youth development that doesn't end just because someone's no longer considered a youth. You're not done with that process in terms of the society's commitment, full stock and barrel of policy and resources in that child's development or that child's genius's development and then invitation out. You're not done as the society with investing those resources into that process until the genius has been integrated. So it's not even enough that the genius is invited out of the child. It's got to be integrated into the whole society. And that's everybody's job to make sure that happens. And there's mentorship that gets assigned, and everyone from the chief, if you want to think of a hierarchy, from the chief down to the person on, at the other side of that spectrum, they're all on the hook. And the mentorship is attuned to what gifts or what traits or what kind of genius is legitimately emerging from the child. What a process of policy development that would cross so many areas of concern for us and budgets and et cetera. How do you police a space like that? Should you police a space like that? Is policing even the right framework, right? So our ancestors have a lot of wisdom in design and practice that we could be learning from, iterating on, and incorporating that we're leaving behind. And I think that is the way forward for the future. Thanks.
Well said. Well said. I'll say thank you all and blessings. Kevin, thank you so much for bringing us together.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted you were all here, and we will talk soon. There will be a recording available and a transcript available just in case you want to go back and say, yeah, that was a smart thing I said.
Go safely, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.